Okay, let's go ahead and dive into this lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to be discussing the surface of Mars and the planet Mars in general. Now, when I first became interested in the topic of Mars, it was really what sparked my whole interest into the ancient astronaut theory. I'm 39 now, and when I first started looking into these topics at 21, someone had just kind of tangentially mentioned to me in college that there was, hey, this face and pyramids on the surface of Mars. Well, I of course didn't, see any interest or belief in this information until I started to, for whatever reason, look into some of the data that's been coming down from what we have on imagery that we get of the orbiters going around Mars. I think at the time, basically, I became aware of a certain company called Malin Space Science Systems. And Dr. Mike Malin, who runs this company, was also located in San Diego, where I was attending college. And it turns out that most of the cameras that we've been placing on the orbiters to take pictures on the ground as well as in orbit were from Malin Space Science Systems. So this was very intriguing to me, and I decided to contact Dr. Mike Malin as a college student and just ask him point blank, is there any possibility that there are artificial structures on Mars? And he said, well, no, there's only sand and weather-eroded objects, which some have portrayed to think look like a face and pyramids. That, of course, raised my eyebrows even further in curiosity because I was able to find 5 to 10 peer-level review scientists that might not work at NASA, but hold PhDs in image analysis and satellite telemetry, where just doing some simple fractal math patterns or some simple algorithms that you can run on satellite telemetry, which we'll see in today's lesson, we clearly see that the areas of Mars called Cydonia definitely merit further attention. Okay, so, if we just kind of look at some basic facts about Mars, we can see that it's about half the diameter of Earth. And really, it started to catch attention even before, the last 50 years of our science. But back in the day, there was a gentleman named Giovanni Schiaparelli that was an Italian astronomer. And, he was making basic observations through his telescope and started to realize that there's canali, is what he called them, on Mars. What he appeared to be observing were ancient canals that possibly were created by some type of, alien race at the time. They were thinking that it's possibly like intelligently built canals connecting waterways, kind of like what we do here on Earth. So that unfortunately died out, the idea that there was, an advanced canal system. But what is interesting about the topic is the idea is that is there ever, or is there even now, water on Mars? And as you can see from these current Mars images, we do have polar ice caps, but we'll take a closer look at some of the surface features as well. This is just another, just a diagram more in the day of Schiaparelli, where he, again, carved out all these intricate, what he appeared to think were canals, all intricately connected to each other. Now, we've sent several probes to the surface of Mars, as well as in orbit around Mars. This is one of the recent ones, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And I've been following these for like 10 years, back in the day when they first sent the Mars Global Surveyor. So it's a very interesting advancement that they've been making in the fields of, space telescopes and being able to have better image detection capabilities for what they're looking for on the surface. So, it's very noteworthy to see that if we just look at some of the packages that we've sent over the last decade, we started collecting packages where we thought, 15 gigabytes of data, of public data, is quite a bit. But you can see that it's literally exponentially grown over the last few years into the fact that now the public amount of data that's being released is just exponentially larger than we've ever had. And, this is supposed to be some of the most powerful technology that we'll have. So we're going to take kind of a closer look at how this technology is being used to take imagery of the surface of the planet and how it's used over certain areas versus other areas does raise a little bit of concern. You can see that this is one of the latest, cameras attached to the orbiter. And again, we're talking about some seriously high-grade equipment. And the imaging technology that we have here is just seriously more advanced than we've ever seen in the public sector. So here's that camera we were just looking at. Now before, we're looking at a standard like a Mars Global Surveyor, which was released in 1998. This was, 150 centimeters per pixel resolution, which, is again, if you get down on objects, all of them are going to become pixelated no matter what they are. But now we're getting down to around 30 centimeters per pixel. And a pixel it's really, really small. So being able to zoom in to a 30 centimeter pixel level is really impressive. And that's only the public camera. I can almost guarantee you that, we also have classified tools attached to some of these orbiters. These packages are, usually under Department of Defense and aren't for public use, but the resolution is much greater than 30 centimeters per pixel. That would probably astound us. Okay, so, again, it's very interesting that we're going to be doing a lot of analysis of Mars. And even here you can see in this region, just looking at, we see what looks like clear water evidence that in the ancient past, water was heavily flowing on the surface of Mars and not probably just trapped in the polar ice cap as it is now. But we're going to come back to some of that imagery and reanalyze that question of water on the surface of Mars now. Various packages are being deployed. They started off with something, again, around 10 years ago called the Pathfinder, and now we have Curiosity and various other packages that we're going to be deploying that work in tandem with the orbiters as well as surface rovers. So we are well equipped to, let's say, take analysis of the surface of the planet. Now, unfortunately, these rovers or any of the tools we're using don't have like a scooping device that's going to go out and pick up like a bug or something on the surface of Mars. Unfortunately, they're still just doing basic detection tools, looking for amino acids and the signs of life. So for all we know, there could be animals hopping around the orbiter, and we might not get publicly released images of those, and the tools aren't going to be able to capture anything on the surface. Mainly, again, the tools that we have are going to be used for being able to just do, simple measurements and microscopic analysis of samples right there on the surface. And this is important because we've seen in the past that, the things that we found that have come to us from Mars. This is actually a famous sample that was found in Antarctica from a meteorite that we know is from Mars. And in it, close up, we see what are clear signs of biological life at a microscopic level, similar to what we have here on Earth. The clear signs of life coming from Mars in the ancient past. So it's very possible that there's current life there now based on the fossilized remains that we've been able to uncover from meteorites. Now again, we're going to have quite an array of scientific packages that are going to be deployed in the next 10 years. And really anyone who's interested in finding out our future in returning to Mars, and I say returning to Mars because as we'll see, there's definitely a deep connection with Mars in our past. And it turns out that even some of the most ancient cultures, the Sumerians, as we learned in lesson 1, had great knowledge and information that Mars was used by the Anunnaki as a way station, that all the mining and efforts that they were doing on Earth, they actually used the surface of Mars to transfer the gold from Earth on its way to Nibiru as a way station on Mars before it would do its final liftoff for Nibiru. And we know that they were mining gold on Earth, taking it to Nibiru and repairing Nibiru's atmosphere. Now, this is a whole other topic that we'll get into in a future lesson, but we definitely know that Mars has had a big part of the history in the ancient astronaut theory. So it makes sense that NASA is probably well aware of some of the artifacts and things on the surface that are part of the overall picture, and we have a very large interest to continue to explore the surface of Mars. Now, I'm not saying that there's a cover-up at NASA. Again, as I've found out, there's many astronomers and technicians and engineers that might work on a certain scientific package to deploy a certain arm on the rover. But, that's about it. Now, at a higher level, though, the mandates and things set forth around what imagery can be released and what areas of Mars they can show us, this is some interesting topics, because there we do have to wonder if NASA, National Aeronautics Space Administration, could possibly stand for never a straight answer. And that's just a joke, of course, but let's just kind of look at some of this information. Since the 1998 Mars Global Surveyor, we've been imaging a certain area of Mars called Cydonia that has a track record going back since the Viking orbiter in the 70s, when we first took pictures of the surface of Mars. And back then, there were a couple of artifacts that came up over the live feed in the 70s, which they don't do anymore, a live feed, that showed what appeared to be a face and pyramids on the surface of Mars. So it took a couple of decades, Mars Global Surveyor, until NASA and the scientific community officially returned with packages to re-image the surface of Mars publicly. Now, some of the technology that we were seeing being displayed showed things like this. Here is a satellite feed of a surface area, and we're going to zoom in on just this one hillside to look at geological changes over time. And you can see that by zooming in on this area, we have a time-dated stamp of 2002 and 2005. And on just this little hillside, we can track that there's been geological changes of some type of drainage, possibly water, or maybe just some sand and wind that changed the surface from 2002 to 2005. But this is at a 200-meter resolution. It's pretty impressive. Now, keep that in mind as we start to look at other areas of the surface of Mars, because this was first picked up in the 1970s from the Viking orbiter. And as it came down the live transmission, they simply labeled it head. And they said that after imaging it at a certain time later, the shadow here caused this light and shadow effect, is the way the sun was hitting it. And so under a different lighting condition where the shadow might move over to here, that the face disappears and there's no longer a face. Wow, that was definitely a wrong answer by NASA, because several people going through the NASA archives, including myself, have found imagery that basically flushes that right down the drain. Data that shows that this definitely does deserve a further scientific appreciation. And again, if we were to just zoom in and look at it, even in this raw data, we can make out what appears to be some type of a headdress, possibly. Symmetry of clearly a face-like structure, eyes, nose, and mouth. So this really does raise a lot of questions into saying, this was just a fragment of light and shadow. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this one specific area where the face has been located. And what's interesting about this area isn't just that there's a face, but the surrounding structures in this area seem to have been mined or have been connected, and possibly are an ancient city that we've now found on Mars. Now, anyone in the topic of ufology might be familiar with Cydonia. It's a very popular topic once you begin looking into the field of ufology or the ancient astronaut theory. But hopefully these lessons can be a good gateway into anyone new to these topics or just being introduced. I also find a lot of people struggle with trying to explain this information, which they might find interesting, but find a hard time relaying it to someone else so that they might get that same spark of interest. Well, that's why Ancient School is a great place, is that you can not only share your interests in learning this information with others, but also refer them and say, listen, just go see for yourself on Ancient School. Okay, so, if we look at some of these images up close in more detail, again, these are all from Viking 1. So this is all data that we originally took in the 70s. We just now, over the last 10 years, have revisited these surface structures. And this is some of the imagery that we've gotten in 1998. Now, what you're going to see here is a very interesting track record that, for some reason, other areas of Mars, the geology and the clarity is immaculate, very impressive. But when we get to the face and the pyramids, all of a sudden the resolution is just thrown out the window. All of our 30 centimeter per pixel high resolution cameras seem to have problems or are being used in a limited fashion. So here's a view of the face in 1998. Now, it still looks like a face. It's very badly eroded. Looks like a bomb hit it, possibly. I don't know. Very bad damage. Something has happened to it, and it's very hard to discern that it's still a face until you look closer. Now, again, we have imaged it in more recent times, and again, it seems as if it's gotten worse. Now, in the original images of 1976, it was clearly a face. There were even different shadow angles confirming that it's a face. Here we find two different samples from that time frame. Shadow is here, the shadow is not there. The sun is literally right overhead. Like I'm the sun, I'm hitting the face here. If I'm the sun, I'm hitting the face from here. The shadow is different, the face is still there. 1998, it looks bad. 2001, even worse. 2002, you see where I'm going. Now, every other area of Mars, the face looks excellent, but for some reason, when they get to this area, we start to have problems. Now, thank you to the research of the Enterprise mission and Richard Hoagland, who might actually be giving you future lessons here at Ancient School. You can see that what they found was that by looking at certain other areas, using the Mars orbital camera from the Global Surveyor, this main camera had a resolution that would look at other areas in great detail, and the resolution that they released for these areas was great. Now, when they took their first images of the face, this is what they released. You had to color enhance it and do data correction to actually see it. And they were only using 2/3 of the available 256 color spectrum of a grayscale image. They weren't using the full data. It's almost like they were hiding it. They reduced the resolution. Why? Well, let's take another look. When you look at this face from 1998 and rotate it 37 degrees so that it's looking at you head on, just like as if you were talking to another face, we can still extrapolate quite a bit of data even from this badly damaged image. Now that I've rotated it 37 degrees, I created a left half and a right half. And by simply looking at these two halves as individual sections, again, some interesting data can be extrapolated. Again, we've just taken the 1998 image, rotating it 37 degrees, and when I split these two sides and mirror them, some interesting pieces of evidence come out here. In this right side, you can clearly see that even though it's badly fragmented, when I flip it and mirror it, we still see facial characteristics, linear characteristics, forehead, eyes, nose, mouth, possibly a beard. Now again, that's some data extrapolation, but when we look at this other side, this left side, and mirror that, something else emerges that's too much to just be by chance. And if we look at this again in detail, what we're seeing is clear symmetry around the headdress. What appears to be some type of actual amulet, possibly a winged disc, some type of Egyptian pharaonic headdress. I mean, this is coming off of the surface of Mars. What's it doing there, right? There has to be a connection here, which can coincidentally, the next lesson, of course, is the Mars-Earth connection in lesson 3. But as we can see here on the surface of Mars, this face just has too many coincidences to just be a natural phenomenon. Eyes, nose, mouth. So all of this, and looking at it even under closer detail, just reveals too much evidence for us to say that this is by natural chance. Now, it is possible that wind or, certain mountains looked at from a certain angle look like a face. And that's the only way that they've tried to attack this, but not with a real mathematical analysis, which we're going to look at here in today's lesson. Now, other areas around the face show symmetry that, again, denote some type of artificial influence. We saw here in 1976 something near the face that appeared to be looking like a dolphin. We couldn't really understand what it was. Well, in 1998, we re-imaged this area, And this dolphin-like figure, whatever it is, has these perfectly cut or tube-like items that again are showing symmetry that is not natural. Something was being done in this region. When we compare the data from 1976 to 1998, basically what we're seeing here is higher resolution of these initial objects that were filmed at Cydonia. For a long time, this has been called the city, possibly a second face here matching the face, but unfinished, and what appear to be pyramids and a fort of some kind, even some type of inner structure of four connected dots, and another pyramid with little nodes coming out of it. And then a very large pyramid down here. Again, the angles on these objects under higher resolution are still being confirmed as pyramids. These are some type of ancient, five-sided pyramids that we can confirm that what we're seeing here is the shadow is hidden in this one, but in this one now the shadow is revealed and we see angular consistency. These little four dots, for an example, now you can see those four dots up close, and those three nodes here are here. So it's very interesting consistency that what we're seeing is possibly an ancient city. Now, there's more to it than that. It's not just the objects, it's the placement of the objects. There's actually quite a bit of geometry that matches up, which we're not going to get into in this lesson. I'm just going to give you a very straightforward approach to showing you there's something that's been going on the surface of Mars. So again, when we look at these structures, this side where the sun, if I'm the sun, this little red dot, I'm now shining on these structures, making a shadow that's coming here. Well, these, now I'm the sun, are right over these structures, clearly showing these once shadowed areas. So in relation to the face, these in fact do still merit further study. And there's that little dolphin we saw a minute ago. Now, what's really interesting is that not only are these all in relation to each other, but they seem to have been placed in a certain area, which I'm going to get back to in a moment. If we dive into just the face for a moment, there's never been any type of actual analysis that says, no, this is a face no matter what angle you look at it from. But actually there has. A gentleman by the name of Dr. Mark Carlotto, who is an imaging specialist, released quite a bit of data in showing that no matter how you look at the 3D imprint of the face, no matter what sun angle you're looking at the face, it's still a face. And pretty much every test that you can run that would show some signs of artificiality, the face passes with, hands down. Now, there were other tests that Dr. Mark Carlotto did that were ingenious in bringing out the data to confirm that the face and surrounding structures are definitely artificial. What we're seeing here is a fractal analysis of the face in two different frames. Here's the face where the angle of the sun, again, if I'm the sun, I'm creating a shadow on the face. There's the shadow. And in this one, the sun is probably right above the face. As you can see, there is no shadow. Two separate frames of the face. When Dr. Mark Carlotto runs a fractal analysis on these two frames, the fractal analysis shows that the face, all of these little highlighted hits, those are a probability of much higher chance to be artificial. Now, he used these same algorithms on Russian satellite telemetry, views over Russia, and using these same fractal analysis, he was able to identify tanks or troops hidden under some tarps or shrubs. So that same type of, aggressive data being run on the surface of Mars, those same algorithms show that the face and surrounding structures come out to be a 98% chance of probability to be artificial. NASA never did any of that type of study publicly. But again, other peer-level review scientists that might not work at NASA have done the research. And this is why it's important to be abreast of this information. Here again is the analysis of the Russian satellite telemetry, where you can see what appear to be tanks and other artificial objects that, when again run under fractal analysis, are clearly identified as artificial, just like the face was. So we really have to take that into account, that a lot of the things that we get on the surface from our space agencies might just be the foot into these topics, the foot crossing into the door, if you will. But you really need to then take the leap yourself and look at some of the data that they're retrieving from these missions, especially on the surface of Mars. As you're going to see in Lesson 3, the Mars-Earth connection coming next week, the data that we've been collecting on Mars, I mean, they should be holding press conferences saying, there's life on Mars, it's confirmed. But NASA doesn't work like that. However, you can freely review all of the data that shows that all the signs are pointing to life is not only prevalent on Mars, but still exists today. So again, just doing that fractal analysis, we can see that these areas, this city and the face, were very prominently detected to be artificial. Okay? Now, there were other strange artifacts on Mars, outside of just the Cydonia region, and I recommend that you definitely check some of these out. I've provided the source material so that you can actually visit these sites and see these things for yourself. They are quite interesting to be aware of, simply for the fact that this is public data. If I can get my tool to work here, excuse me, I'm trying to click on the link for you. I can't do it in the presentation. I always get this mixed up, so forgive me. I wanted to click on the link for you, but there is always an interesting correlation between the data that we have. Here we go. That is freely available. Where again, it's just these little tiny things. Oh, here's a random image from we're logged in here, and they give you the area that they're zooming in on, and then of course when we really zoom in on this strip, it's not just that one thing that I was showing you that's of interest. There's all these tube-like structures and various other things that should merit attention. But there's also, again, these things that just really, raise a lot of questions. And sometimes it's kind of fun to hunt through these artifacts. I'd have to actually click on one of these and see in detail what we're looking for. But all of that data that I show in the presentation, all of these frames are available, and they're, NASA released for the public. Now, there have been a few other things with the surface of Mars that go back into the past and raise a lot of questions. Mars has 2 moons that orbit the planet, and the main moon, Phobos, had what we'll call a Soviet close encounter. When the Russians first started to send their own probes and take pictures back in the 70s, one of their probes got very close to Phobos and was hitting it with radar, and the last frame that the satellite picked up was this. And this little beam of light, it's not coming from the satellite. It was coming from the moon of Phobos towards the satellite right before they lost transmission of Phobos 1. So it's very interesting that even, Phobos 2. It's very interesting that what we're seeing is possibly some type of energy beam coming from the moon of Mars and basically shutting off one of our spacecraft, saying, you're not going to shoot us with your laser beams. And other things that they were shooting on the surface of Mars at that time are unexplainable. Here was a large surface. Something was on the surface. Now, they were taking infrared, and so all they got was a shadow of some large object, not on the surface of Mars, but creating this shadow above the surface of Mars. This really does raise a lot of questions. I can only imagine what's actually going on the planet Mars, but if we look at anything with our space track record, when we landed a man on the moon in 1969, it's not like we stopped. We stopped going publicly. All of the information from the astronauts who have now spoken out tell us when they were up there on their tricycles, the military was on the surface of the moon in a Ferrari. They even saw cities on the backside of the moon. It's almost like we're not allowed to travel to these other planets in our solar system. Probably because they're already occupied. Now, we have to wonder again why we're not being told about all the clear and obvious data that there is an atmosphere to Mars. You can even see it in some of these images. There are polar ice caps, and there's clear signs of water. I mean, look at all this frozen snow on the surface of Mars. I wonder if there's good skiing. There's clear data that shows even now what appears to be flowing water, changes in the geography. This is a GIF animation of current data from ESA that shows flowing water, changes of water levels on the surface of Mars. We really have to wonder why this is not being told to us. And there's clear evidence from all of our instrumentation on the surface now that the water levels did exist. All of this is clear signs of an ancient waterbed, a salty waterbed at that. Not only just water, but all the acids and amino acids and things that are needed for there to be a rich atmosphere of life we see in the ancient areas of Mars that we've been looking at. So I really have to wonder if we do go back to Mars with human beings within our lifetime. I definitely believe that by 2025, there has to be public missions going on. I mean, we'll be sending internet-controlled live drones by private companies, not government-controlled. Private companies will have missions where you can control your own space bot, if you will, and look at things on the surface of the planets live. So I really do wonder what's going to happen when we actually get to go back with real people and publicly controlled tools. I think what we're going to find is that our history on these other worlds within our own solar system is deeply embedded, and of course especially on Mars. I mean, there's no question that the Anunnaki, the ancient Sumerian gods at least, were using Mars to do mining. The whole face itself was a large monument to be contributed towards one of the Anunnaki gods, Enki. So we have to understand that there is a large and infinite amount of data that we're still going to receive about Mars. And really that's exciting, is finding out all this new data that confirms our ancient connection with Mars. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Anunnaki. Now, this is a topic that I obviously like to dive into in multiple lessons. We've touched a little bit on some of the previous topics. Today, we're going to dive into it a little bit more thoroughly. Now, the topic of the Anunnaki is something that's obviously coming to us from these ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets that seem to parallel many of the modern-day biblical tales that we have in either the Hebrew version or the English version, the New King James Version. So I think it's very interesting to realize that a lot of the tales that we have in this consolidated biblical version of today can be found in these earlier Sumerian versions. And the Sumerian versions are very specific about a time when the giants were among us, or a time when we lived amongst these gods we called the Anunnaki. So many of these consolidated biblical references of angels, or again, a time when giants walked upon the earth, I think we're talking about this Sumerian epic. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that it appears that the Anunnaki visited Earth hundreds of thousands of years before these interactions with the Sumerian culture. So we'll kind of start off talking about that, the reasons why they came to Earth, and see if that doesn't shed some more light into what could be possibly coming in the future with these interactions with these Anunnaki beings. Now, we know that they came here 450,000 years ago to mine gold. As the texts explain, the Anunnaki in their own rise to a technological civilization damaged their planet Nibiru. They damaged the atmosphere of Nibiru. Now, by taking fine particulates of gold and precious metals, the Anunnaki found that they could repair Nibiru's dwindling atmosphere by patching it with these particulates of gold. Now, even today, we use gold in our spacecraft and various things as insulating technology. even in our computers. So it makes sense that they would be utilizing gold to repair their atmosphere in this fashion. So the texts get very specific in explaining that they originally came to Africa and found large deposits where they set up mining outposts hundreds of thousands of years ago, where the Anunnaki themselves were mining the gold out of southern Africa. They quickly realized that mining the gold themselves was quite a toil and didn't enjoy doing it. So they rebelled. Several Anunnaki rebelled to Enlil and Enki, the main leaders, and said, listen, we're sick of mining the gold ourselves. Why can't we create a robot or fashion a being to do this mining for us? So they decided to take the natural Neanderthal man that was evolving here on Earth and simply combine part of their genes, 80% of the Anunnaki genes, with the base 20% of the Neanderthal here to create us in their image and after their likeness. And as we'll discuss, they literally are our gods in creating us to be like them. So we'll come back to that topic. But clearly the evidence shows that if we were created to do the mining of gold, the mining operation started hundreds of thousands of years ago in southern Africa. Now, Michael Tellinger has also been looking at several of the sites in Africa and realizing these might be connected to or speaking about some of these ancient mines that we know were found in southern Africa. So there is kind of a large gap in time from the recorded time frames geologically that we see mining taking place in southern Africa, as well as mitochondrial DNA evidence that we've now put forth to say mankind that looks like us shows up in southern Africa 300,000 years ago. There was a Time magazine article called The Mitochondrial Eve, where using mitochondrial DNA, which is only inherently passed down through females, we can see that the mutation that looks like us first shows up in southern Africa 300,000 years ago. So very close to the Sumerian information that the Anunnaki originally came here, were mining these gold, these various places in southern Africa, and then created us in their image and after their likeness to do the mining for them. It seems very interesting that even to this day, when we look at gold or we hold gold, it's so precious to us and we get a sensation from seeing it. So from the time that the Anunnaki got here, 450, 300,000 years ago, up until the Sumerian time, which is just 6,000 years ago, there is a large gap that we're still trying to uncover. Now, many other sites around the world, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, or the Easter Island, the Moai Heads on Rapa Nui there are locations all around the world that we're starting to uncover and realize civilization goes much further beyond 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago, the Sumerian culture. But we're going to heavily look at the Sumerian culture because the evidence that they've left us about the Anunnaki is overwhelming. No other culture outside of the Hindus and their talks of the Mahabharata and various gods and flying around in Vimana, the Anunnaki are really well documented from the Sumerian civilization and give us a wealth of information into the insights of these beings. Now, we see all over ancient Sumerian times, again, this is roughly today, Iran, Iraq, many of these Middle Eastern countries have this type of a wall relief inscribed in places where it's not even very easy to reach. This was on the side of a cliff, very difficult to even reach to film. But you can see a very eloquent scene. There's even Sumerian cuneiform hieroglyphs and text, inscribed here. But this classic scene of what appears to be a being on a winged disc coming down. This is depicted all over the Middle Eastern countries, where it seems to have originally started in Sumer, this influence of these beings, the Anunnaki, always being depicted coming down in this winged disc and interacting with the people below them. So we have to understand that the Sumerian culture is literally the oldest civilization that we currently have on record. Now, as I've stated, we are finding remnants of older cultures going back 13,000 BC, maybe even as well as 50,000 BC, but not a complete civilization like we found in ancient Sumer. And again, what's really interesting about this is the wealth of information that we have. their daily routines and things that they went through, but also sacred information, thousands of tablets, where they claim to have interacted with these beings, the Anunnaki. A high priest would sit with a scribe in front of an Anunnaki, and the high priest would take and hear sacred information told by the Anunnaki to the high priest, and the scribe would be furiously writing this all down. So we have all of this information preserved, still in stone, of what the Sumerians learned from the Anunnaki. Now, the famous author, Zecharia Sitchin, was really one of the first to come under controversial, to basically start a controversy, if you will, over these lost texts, these ancient Sumerian tablets. And really, even today, Zecharia Sitchin still gets a lot of skepticism. But you have to understand there's two ways to argue this ancient astronaut theory. There's the visual information. You know, we have artifacts and pyramids and this sort of thing. But then there's also the linguistic information, the actual written word. Visual references, written word. Two separate tracks that one can look at to understand what's happened in the past. Now, the written word is a little bit more controversial than the artifacts and visualizations. We can all see what a pyramid looks like a pyramid, or something that looks like a winged disc appears to be representing flight. But the text, this is where there's always been a divergence, where people who try to speak against Zecharia Sitchin or speak against Eric von Daniken. Well, Eric von Daniken's always been the visual guy, showing all the visualizations of monuments and artifacts around the world. Zecharia Sitchin has always been the linguistic guy, the guy that understands the actual translations. I guarantee you, many of the people out there that claim to refute Zecharia Sitchin spent 50 years, 50 years looking into these topics. Raised in Palestine and being able to speak and translate Hebrew directly, he had a much more intimate knowledge of these Semitic languages, these Middle Eastern languages. He was able to actually translate cuneiform script. There's only about 400 people in the world today that can accurately translate cuneiform script directly. I guarantee you, most of those authors out there today talking against Zecharia Sitchin do not translate cuneiform script. Now, having said that, that's just the linguistic information, the words. And if you want to squabble over the meaning of the term Anunnaki or Nibiru, or properly interpret the Enuma Elish, some of these sacred Sumerian texts, then you need to understand the words, the linguistic side. Zecharia Sitchin was a complete scholar. I have yet to find anyone other than Emiel Maloan and various other Sumerologists that, again, looked at the linguistic translations. And that can be a debate on its own. But then again, there's this other side, the visual references. And that's where we're going to focus in today's lesson of the Anunnaki, the visual references. This cannot be discounted. It's only open for interpretation. And the beauty of this visual information is we see this ubiquitous. All around the world, there is the same references, beings coming down from the skies depicted with wings. Not just the Anunnaki, Hindu gods, Mesoamerican gods, as well as South Africa, and even, of course, as we're looking into today, the Middle East. So please understand that when you hear people claiming Zecharia Sitchin is wrong or that he's been refuted, no, he hasn't. Maybe one person disagrees with his linguistic translation, but if you ask anybody who has a problem with Zecharia Sitchin, say, do you believe in the ancient astronaut theory in general? I bet they'll tell you no. So keep that in mind when looking at this topic of ancient astronaut evidence. There are the visual references shared across the world from all cultures. Then there's the linguistic information, which requires more of an academic framework to actually play on that battlefield. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the visual references. So when we realize that the Sumerian culture, which existed in this fertile strip of land, Mesopotamia, Babylon, between the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, all of the pictorial evidence that we have of these beings are very consistent. And just like the Egyptian culture, I think that we get more information from hieroglyphic and pictograms than we do from the written word. Most people have to understand that, for instance, Egyptian hieroglyphics are like acronyms. When you see one syllable of a hieroglyph from Egypt, think of it as an acronym like FYI or CIA or NSA. When you instantly see FYI, for your information, you know that it's conveying several words by one small syllable, an acronym. That's exactly what many of these pictograms display, from ancient Sumer as well as ancient Egypt. The visualizations, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This could never be more true. So understand that when we start to look at this information, that it doesn't directly translate to our A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Many of these things are represented in a symbol that represent an acronym of today. CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, narrowed down to 3 words. So that's exactly what we see in a lot of these artifacts. So the symbolic references being displayed to ancient man to us today, again, you could interpret this visualization of a man that has the power of flight. He even has the ability to land, somehow landing gear, and he was in a circular craft, and he was holding circular devices, maybe manipulating some type of gears. How else could they describe what they were seeing without giving it a natural layer to describe it? Bird-like features, landing gear, or things that you would see that hold up a table. So very simplistic viewpoints to explain complex things. Now, when we look at this ancient symbology of the Anunnaki, there are several different references. This one is a classic depiction of an Anunnaki that's in charge of the spaceport. Now, you can see they only have one set of wings and kind of a bird-like feature. And this one happens to be holding the fruit of life and the water of life. And symbolically, they have on these wristwatch-looking gear. It could just be a band, but it does look very wristwatch-like. Now, what's interesting to note is there are various types of Anunnaki depicted, some with 2 wings, some with 4, some with human faces, some with bird faces. But I think they're trying to convey to us the power of flight. This depiction, again, being a commander of a spaceport, that's very specific. Now, if we look at the literal interpretation of this information, beings like this were said to have been seen at places like Baalbek in Lebanon. One of the ancient Sumerian kings, King Gilgamesh, talks about, in one of the ancient texts, talks about how he came to this place where the gods descend and ascend from the heaven. And this is where you would see the symbol of this type of an Anunnaki. Here at this one location, Baalbek in Lebanon, we see these large trilithiton stones stacked to make a platform, which we'll see in a minute. And these are perfect locations to have exactly described what we hear in these stories of a commander of a spaceport piloting these craft that make large flames and smoke and thunderous sounds as they come down or go into the heavens. So this exactly describes what we would call today a rocket launch. So a lot of these things where they're the commander of a spaceport actually are very much in alignment with them trying to visualize these people have the power of flight. Now, when we look at our own symbology of when we landed the man on the moon the first time, again, using an eagle, we're doing it symbolically to say that we have the power of flight, right? Now, it's just like the Anunnaki's description of showing them with wings. It's only to say that they had the power of flight. This is exactly what we conveyed when we first landed the man on the moon, and this famous phrase that was used.
Big shadow. Forward, drift into the right, low. 30 seconds. Forward, drift. We copy it down, Eagle. The Eagle has landed.
The eagle has landed. Now, we have to understand, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide here, that there are many references in ancient times to the power of flight. Just like symbolically we were showing that we have the power of flight, it's very possible that we can take a literal interpretation and look at all of this ancient evidence and realize we're seeing the building blocks and the stories to create an actual history of interaction where beings were ascending and descending over and over in front of these ancient cultures that did not have any other way to depict what they were seeing other than to use a natural layer of description. No technological references. But when we look at the evidence, this is exactly what we see, is a technological layer of evidence being left. Many of these blocks, for instance, as I just mentioned, Baalbek in Lebanon, these were stones that were quarried several miles away and then carried many miles and stacked in Baalbek in Lebanon to make these large platforms. But as you can see, these rocks weigh hundreds of tons. We would struggle immensely today to literally pull a rock out of the ground this big and then transport it. Very difficult for even modern technology to accomplish something like that. Yet, this is what we see all over the ancient times, is that they were moving these megalithic stones, stones that weigh hundreds of tons, and perfectly stacking them to make these large platform-like edifices. You can see a gentleman standing here next to these blocks to give you a relation to the size. And here's another gentleman again standing in relation to these size. These are huge stones, and this type of architecture is again worldwide. We see this at many megalithic sites. The ability for them to do, one, use mortarless technology. The stones are all fit together so perfectly, there's no mortar or anything holding them together. And the immensity of the stones, the sheer size is just off the charts. We can't do this today, folks. We can't build and stack stones of this size. How are the ancients able to do it? So when we look at a lot of these sites, again, the architecture and overall planning is incredible, but they also appear to look like, this could just be a ceremonial top, but to me, it very clearly looks like it could be a landing platform, some type of ancient space pad that rockets were ascending or descending from these locations. And it's all fit to have, the perfect place where it's like a big ceremony of watching these launches and things take place. So it's very possible that a lot of these locations are actually describing ancient rocket ships, ancient landing pads, for whatever intents and purpose. I can't tell you that they were anti-gravitic UFOs or some advanced spaceship. What we have are depictions of ancient rocket ships. Now, this seems illogical because we think that advanced alien races or people that would be spacefaring visiting ancient man would be super advanced. We still don't have all the facts. We still don't understand. But what we do know is the correlation of the imagery shown matches our current technology today of gas-propelled rocket ships. Maybe they're using some type of different propulsion. We still don't have all the facts, but clear representations that rocket ships were being seen thousands of years ago. So we just have to kind of reanalyze some of the obvious things that we're seeing right in front of us that very much resemble today a launch pad or a place where we would launch things into space. It requires a very large lifted surface or flat surface to be able to make our craft ascend or descend accurately. And that's exactly what we see in a lot of these ancient sites. So aside from just the actual landing spots, these large landing pads in various locations, we have what appear to be actual space information. Now, I say this loosely because there are the artifacts of what the ancient man was seeing being piloted, the actual craft, but then we have actual astronomical data that we can now confirm as being accurate. This is a tablet being held by Zacharias Sitchin, and it's a very interesting circular tablet, which they didn't even think that ancient Sumerians were familiar with the shape of an ellipse, yet here they are using a circular tablet. Now, on this information, you can see it's very badly weathered, but some of it is decipherable in a couple of locations. And what we get here is some very interesting information. Now you can see under a higher resolution shot of this tablet that a couple of these areas that are not so damaged reveal, again, very interesting astronomical data when translated. This section blown up has what appears to say on the edges, rocket, rocket, mountain, mountain, pile up, high, high, high. The names of the planets like Pluto and Neptune and Uranus all had Sumerian names that were listed on this tablet. And you can see here that there was actual descriptions of the planet course corrections the Anunnaki would have to take when coming from their planet Nibiru, passing by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 planets, coming to the 7th planet of Earth. So they literally explain astronomical course corrections of how they would navigate until they got to the 7th planet, from their planet to Earth. Various information actually talking about space travel on a 6,000-year-old tablet. Now, if that wasn't just the same, the depictions and descriptions that we have of the craft used by the Anunnaki explain these rocket ship-like craft that would be in outer space orbiting, and then a smaller craft would come down and detach to land on Earth. Exactly the depictions that we have of our modern space capsules. Even in India, we have the depictions of the various Buddha and other sacred beings depicted in these stupa, which again look very similar to a space capsule. So we have to wonder if this Sumerian Shem is the word, or what appears to be an ancient rocket. This is again Baalbek in Lebanon, a rocket being depicted on that large landing pad. Many depictions of these ancient rockets, again, are in alignment with rocket pads or launching pads, these large megalithic sites that we have that would have served perfect places to launch or land these types of craft. And again, we have these depictions coming from all over the ancient world. This was actually inscribed on the tomb of an Egyptian governor. And you can see here that this is land level because there's people and animals and plants and what appears to be the top part of a rocket. And then we can see going underground, just like a missile silo, right? You can see that the other part of the rocket has the living corridors and what appear to be even showers. I mean, what are we talking about here, folks? This is a depiction of a rocket ship from an ancient Egyptian tomb, actually inscribed on his tomb. So these are all over the world. This again is from the tomb of Pakal, and we have what appears to be King Pakal seated in a rocket ship and manipulating levers and gears. His nose is even in some type of breathing apparatus. And you can see even what appears to be flames coming out of the back of this ancient rocket ship. Now again, we have to understand that these depictions make a lot of sense when we look at what we're seeing and think this looks like a rocket ship. This looks like someone preparing to go into the stars, to go into space. Now, with our understandings of space travel today, we have to look at this information and realize that what we're seeing can't be just a coincidence, that this type of visual information, again, visual, is clearly speaking the same story over and over from cultures around the world. Now, again, this ancient rocket ship is, something that we see from various cultures. This one in particular was found in Turkey, I believe, and it was first found by Zachariah Sitchin. And he contacted the curator and said, listen, I understand that you don't want to say it's a rocket ship, but why don't you at least put it on display and let the audience decide? Zachariah Sitchin was able to convince them to put it on a limited basis and show this as an artifact that they couldn't quite explain its purpose, but clearly it has rocket-like characteristics. We see the nose of the rocket ship, a man seated with his knees bent here. He's missing his head, but then clearly rocket-like characteristics. So it really does start to raise a lot of questions. And now specifically when we get into these depictions of the Anunnaki, again, we realize that the biblical interpretation of some of these stories, the English version, we have the Sumerian original version still recorded in stone. This is an actual depiction of the tree of life. And you can see that there's an actual Sumerian tale being inscribed here on the wall with this. And again, this depiction of the winged disc, always prominent. And you can see here like a gentleman piloting it. It's not just the winged disc, it's an actual person in there too. Over and over, and they're pointing up to it. Over and over, this is depicted. This has to be some depiction of an ancient spacecraft. They had no way to interpret or understand a flying vehicle other than to depict it the best way they could. A circular craft that had the power of flight, so they give it wings. How else could they explain a circular craft that was flying? Now, what's really interesting about a lot of these tales of the Anunnaki in the biblical sense is, we have the story of Adam and Eve, or the Garden of Eden, or even the flood tablet. Again, we have Sumerian derivatives that speak of an Anunnaki doing the same type of story, but thousands of years ago in the biblical reference. So the whole creation story of creating the atom. Now, in the English version, we have, Adam and Eve and taking the rib and various things, but we have actually a word in Hebrew, Adamu, which means worker. And in the Sumerian version, there's an actual god, one of the Anunnaki named Ishtar, and she is actually attributed with making the first atom. There's actually a depiction of her holding up the first version that worked, meaning they tried several models where the arm didn't function or the leg didn't work, until finally they had the perfect working model, which they called the atom. So just like there are 7 days of creation, in the Sumerian version there are 7 tablets of creation. And this is an actual scene depicted of when Ninhursag finally made the perfect working model. She says, "My hands have made it." And you can see that they're like doing something with a jar or holding some type of a test tube with vases. Maybe this was some type of primitive in vitro fertilization process. We don't know. But the evidence clearly is stating that they made us in their image and after their likeness. And if we look at the genetic symbology being depicted from this time of inception of what we use today, it all makes sense. All of this comes from the Sumerian tales. Now, these are various depictions of the god Enlil and Enki. You can see here this double entwined serpent as the representation of the god is being used even today as a double entwined serpent that represents 2 things: medical knowledge, but the symbol of our DNA. All these ancient symbols of entwined serpents, that's knowledge of genetic information. That's saying they understood the power of genetics. Somehow these ancient Anunnaki chose to use the symbol of entwined serpents to depict medical knowledge because they understood they were modifying our DNA. Now, even today, we see this medical symbol used everywhere in times of health or in times of safety. This medical symbol is a representation handed down by thousands of years of knowledge of genetic manipulation to our DNA. Can't just be by chance. So we have to recognize that they did have the power of flight. Now, there's 2 things to note about the Anunnaki. 1, they're always depicted with wings. 2, angels were always depicted with this glow, or would sometimes have a ring above their head, a halo. Well, it turns out the Anunnaki come from a glowing planet. If you are what you eat, Nibiru was a bright glowing planet. It was always symbolized as a red glowing cross in the sky. If the Anunnaki come from a glowing planet, natural luminescence, just like we see here on Earth, there are fireflies or certain fish that have natural luminescence. The Anunnaki had a natural luminescence about them. If you saw an Anunnaki standing in front of you, you'd say he had a kind of a glow about him, an aura. So if we combine the fact of this glow and the idea that they're always depicted with wings, we can realize that a lot of these depictions take on a new meaning. Some of these Anunnaki, again, depicted with the long beard and more human-like and having bull horns and 2 sets of wings, establish more of an authority figure. And there are various depictions, again, where sometimes they only have 2 wings or 4, and various types of headdresses, from the eagle-like headdress to the more human-like headdress. This being the commander of a spaceport, this being more just a general god. So it is very interesting, the subtle nuances. And again, you can see the text inscribed here on the wall describing a tribute to this god. Now, a lot of these scenes, again, we see over and over the same depiction. A platform being built, the humans, or the taxpayers, holding up the platform for the king to have this interaction with the gods. The being always in some type of a winged disc coming down to the god, to greet the god, to depart sacred wisdom. And this scene is depicted over and over, all over the Middle East. They went to great lengths in carving these on artifacts and wall carvings. This was something very momentous that took place, not mythology. How else could they describe beings that came to visit them? Now, here's another interesting interpretation. William Henry is another researcher that believes in the idea of stargates and wormholes. But we do see this depiction in various scenes of the Anunnaki. what appears to either be a watery doorway or this symbol of a gateway, some type of wormed infused hole or a door that goes inward. Is it possible that the Anunnaki are literally coming out of a stargate and interacting with ancient man? We just don't know. But a lot of their astronomical data, a lot of their information about the movements of the heavens very accurately show they knew what they were talking about. So when they give reference to this other planet Nibiru, we have to understand that this also is a sacred line of information that shouldn't be discounted. Many people struggle with the term Nibiru today, trying to put it into the proper meaning or context of their own viewpoint, but we still don't understand other than the references from these ancient cultures. And there are over 30 cultures that actually reference a dual sun understanding, which is actually a separate topic from Nibiru, but again, advanced astronomical data. So we see this again being depicted on many walls and reliefs all through Iran and Iraq, where the king and the high priests are being held up by the people to see this ceremonial interaction with the winged disc. And, again, this isn't just slapped up on a wall with some graffiti. They went to great lengths to carve these into various precious stones and monuments. So I think it's interesting to look at these, again, various depictions of the Anunnaki, always in intricate detail, shown sometimes with a stylized headdress that's more bird-like, or just more of as a man. But then there's these subtle nuances of 2 wings or 4 wings. And I know this must mean some deep symbolic references to having a higher state of space travel or a higher sense of power, having, the double set of wings. But again, there's always this infused astronomical information, this layer of them talking about the stars, the distance between the planets, what the planets actually look like in space. So we're going to look at several artifacts that, again, the visual information is where it's most intriguing. Most of this information, again, is trying to bequeath a lot of information with just a few different symbols. What I can interpret to see here is we see, again, the winged disc. But what we also see are the 7 dots that represent Earth. So all throughout this scene, you can see this reference of the winged disc and the 7 dots of Earth. And this seems to be some ceremonial description of something happening between the gods that are coming from Nibiru to Earth. Now, again, we see this reference of a Sumerian priest leading another Sumerian to greet an Anunnaki and receive sacred information. And you can see that in various museums. We have actual translations provided by the Louvre and various museums where these are on display, and they give a very generic description. A goddess stands behind the owner of a seal, who is being led by a second goddess before the king, who is seated on an elaborate throne, and just kind of goes on and gives this very mundane observation of what we're seeing. Well, again, looking at some of these through the ancient astronaut lens, we realize that the astronomical references and some of these interaction with these Anunnaki, this couldn't have been just mythological information. They were actually, upholding momentous locations that took place. So that's exactly what we see in a lot of these scenes, is sacred information bequeathing when a god or a high priest had this interaction. And there's usually some type of an astronomical symbol present. And again, we have these mundane translations where we can at least get a baseline of description for what these things are representing. So these various artifacts all over the British Museum, the Louvre, show the cylinder seal with the reversed carved picture, and then the cylinder seal pressed into the wet clay and then hardened into stone to leave the positive imprint, and sometimes various different stones or just a picture of it. But we have many of these artifacts in complete intact form, the cylinder seal, the tablet, as well as the written texts. So lots of these artifacts that give us the ability to paint a very thorough picture of ancient Sumer. Now, this one I found to be very interesting. Even though it's hard to make out, we see this depiction of what appears to be some type of rod of power. Now, whether or not this is like a rocket ship next to some type of a launching pad, just like today when we launch a rocket, it's next to like a pad that falls away as the rocket goes up. We see these depictions over and over and have to wonder what they're trying to tell us. And again, this is kind of the staple question about depictions with wings is, did they really have wings? Or are they just trying to depict that they had the power of flight? If you think about it, ancient man would have no way to give a technological reference, anti-gravity or a plane. All they could do is reference a bird or things flying in the sky. But they went to another length above that. They gave astronomical references as well. It appears that they watched the heavens over hundreds of years because this interaction with the Anunnaki told them and taught them about this sacred celestial knowledge. We've divided the heavens into 12 parts. You can even see here on this ancient Sumerian tablet various zodiacal references, their knowledge of the 12 houses of the zodiac. And again, this is a much larger celestial time where we see artifacts and astronomical observations that seem to track where ancient people were in this larger 24,000 cycle of time, this 24,000 year cycle of time. In modern times, we call it the precession of the equinox, but our current model is slightly off. And as you'll learn from ancient school, we're looking into a much deeper model to explain this model of precession. So a lot of these tablets, again, were on semi-precious stones, but depicted very interesting tales and always inconspicuously had this winged disc. Now, what we see here is possibly the depiction of the winged disc for the planet where they come from, Nibiru, as well as the crescent moon, the main moon of Nibiru. So it's interesting to see how the symbol of even Nibiru has evolved from originally being depicted as a cross to even in more recent times taking on the symbol of the winged disc. Now, these depictions of flight we see over and over again. We see these depictions coming over and over of the power of flight, always being referenced as some type of flying craft in the sky. And even in some of the most ancient stones that we have, it's very clearly depicted as, again, this winged disc above the population. Various coins and other artifacts memorialize this interaction, and we even see other types of hybrid beings, whether it be the Minotaur, the Sphinx. We have to understand that if there was genetic manipulation on us in the past, some of these other beings that we see depicted as the Sphinx or the Minotaur make a lot more sense that if there was genetic manipulation on us, there could have been genetic manipulation on other species. So a lot of these tablets, again, are just a wealth of information, but are doing it in pictogram form. You can see that these are very badly damaged and hard to decipher, but artists have gone to great detail in kind of reclaiming what we see here. And most times we have these, again, astronomical references, some kind of knowledge that's talking about the stars. Here again, we have the depiction of some type of a being inside of the winged disc, and again, hovering over the tree of life. And we have these mundane explanations, but we just have to wonder, really, what is actually being depicted from their point of view. So the Sumerians left us, again, just a plethora of various tablets and artifacts that speak of a time when they lived amongst these gods, the Anunnaki. And we have to understand that this probably wasn't mythology. There are now even other edifices that we've discovered on other planets, like Mars, that clearly the face on Mars was talked about by the Sumerian culture. There was actually depictions of the Anunnaki using Mars, where they would mine the gold on Earth, weigh it on Mars, and then transfer it to Nibiru. So many of these depictions of what we see Mars being used as a way station or as an outpost make a lot of sense when we realize thousands of years ago there was interplanetary travel taking place by these Anunnaki and leaving their footprints not only on Earth but also on Mars. Looking at the face on Mars as we've done already, clearly this is an edifice that has human-like characteristics, Sphinx-like characteristics. So we really have to wonder about this Mars-Earth connection and understand that this could actually possibly be not a humanoid face, but the face of an Anunnaki. Now, one last or a couple things I want to point out here is, these helpers of the Anunnaki, various depictions going even as far back to 7000 BC. There are these small statues and figurines that are described in Sumerian tales as being the helpers of the Anunnaki. They would help fly the craft of the Anunnaki or help in medical experiments. We really have to wonder about this information. it really raises a lot of questions in similarity to the modern day gray aliens. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up here on understanding that when we speak of this time when there were giants upon the earth, we have to look back to an older epoch of time, the Sumerian culture, which had existed at 6,000 years ago, or right around 4,000 BC. But there is probably a lost wealth of evidence that we still have yet to unearth about the Anunnaki. Stay tuned to learn more. One last thing I'm going to point out is, when we invaded Iraq in 2003, the reason was for nuclear weapons. An off-the-book ufological reason was, many of these times when soldiers were going into Saddam's various palaces, they would find these immaculate scenes where Saddam was paying tribute to the Anunnaki. There were even stories that Saddam wanted to build a theme park dedicated to the Anunnaki. So it makes sense that it is possible that the Iraqi government found some type of ancient technology and was reverse engineering this, and the UN or world governments didn't want them to have access to the type of space technology and things that we do through our reverse engineering. So they went in there under the disguise of, let's get nuclear weapons out of their hands, but they might have been extracting some lost ancient technology. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Where do we come from? This is obviously one of the oldest questions that man has been trying to answer, and we can look at it from two perspectives: the modern angle of science and the ancient lens of our past. Combining those two gives us a very interesting view of our future. So today we're going to look at some of the scientific norms for understanding where we come from a very high level, and then curtail that into some of the information about some of the ancient sources of information, specifically looking at one of the biblical tales that comes out of ancient Iraq called the Sumerian cuneiform scripts. Now, there are obviously many different creation tales from the biblical side, whether you look at the Hindu tales, the Mayan tales today, or even North American tales, but today we're going to be focusing on ancient Iraq's biblical tales. Southern Iraq today has been called the cradle of civilization. It was once called Mesopotamia, Babylon, but originally Sumer in 3800 BC is where modern academics place the shoulders for the rise of civilization. So we'll focus on the creation tales of Sumer, but let's dive into some of the scientific aspects of where do we come from. Okay, so obviously in looking at it from today's lens of the modern science view, we look at it using pretty much terrestrial-based sciences, but also now extrasolar sciences, looking for how life possibly could have evolved whole and complete and arrived here on Earth and then gone through another evolutionary process. It's very hard to explain how life started here on Earth given the 4.7 billion years of evolution that's been happening since the Earth came into from a magma state into a hardened, crystallized planet. We're talking about 4.7 billion years. And so in that amount of time, we still really don't have enough for somehow a lightning bolt to strike some amino acids and magically create a living mechanism that intakes nutrients and expels waste. There are still a lot of questions that need to be raised in order to find the answers. What we can look at too, obviously, is external from our own solar system and external from our own planet, and the idea that we've been able to trace that everything seems to be expanding in our universe from one simple point that they would have called the Big Bang. Now, looking at this epoch of time that has spread out as the universe has continually been expanding from this Big Bang is a very interesting theory, and it looks at how the solar system and planets and various other neighboring solar systems could be affected as they continue to expand out. But when we get into the more specific aspects of, well, how did life evolve here on our planet, this starts to raise a lot more questions around how is it possible that life had the amount of time to evolve in 4.7 billion years. So right now, when we look at that track, there's some discrepancies. And so one of the latest scientific ideas is called panspermia, in that to have created some type of life in an already minimal state functioning, that could have arrived on Earth in a prekaryote, or we have various names for life forms at a simplistic form that possibly could have been brought here on a comet, and then once placed into the oceans of Earth or on the landmass over millions, possibly billions of years, we then have an extended evolution. Now, there are still gaps in that, obviously, too, as we approach human evolution, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But obviously, looking at some of these esoteric topics, it's very interesting to note that the scientific community has been revising its understanding of the creation tales of life from a scientific viewpoint, because there really isn't any way to explain life kind of evolving here naturally on Earth. The understanding today is an analogy that if a lightning bolt struck a pool of amino acids and somehow whimsically made that into a life form, the chances of that happening are like a tornado going through a junkyard and correctly assembling a 747. Not going to happen. Could happen, but just not going to happen on the logical side of variables. So a lot of these new theories about panspermia, life arrives whole and complete, a lot of the things that they see out there in space when they sample comets and various debris, is that there are a lot of mechanisms already in place for life to evolve in space under freezing temperatures. Buckyballs and various complex carbohydrates and amino acids that are needed to form life, we find freely floating around in space. So it's very possible that through natural evolution, life actually arrives whole and complete here on Earth and then starts an evolutionary process. And even recently, there's been a twist on the panspermia idea, is directed panspermia. So that's some type of life form, right? Some type of literal intelligence directs life to this planet. So very interesting that they've had so many questions raised that they're now starting to even put the idea out there from a scientific level to say it can't be by chance that life has been evolving on this specific planet. And it's probably not. I think as we expand our sciences to other planets, we're going to quickly see within the next 10 to 20 years that life is being harbored on all of the planets within our solar system. That's my personal opinion. But that's based on the evidence that I've been looking at from all the conglomerate space agencies deploying packages across the solar system. Okay, so some of those packages that we can look at as an example would be Europa. Now, Jupiter's moons have all types of different geological surfaces. We see some of the moons have volcanic activity, some of the moons have deep oceans, like Europa, possibly a 40-mile deep ocean, but it's covered by this sluggish ice layer that's kind of always shifting around. So they theorize, just like on Earth, if we go down to the deep parts of the ocean on Earth, we find these thermal vents where there's no sunlight, just heat and minerals emitting out of a vent, and there's life all around the vent, shrimp, crabs, all kinds of just insects and things that are living off this well, I shouldn't say insects, I guess, more or less just plant life and plankton and such, microscopic animals that are all living off of this hot vent. So the same idea applies that if we were to go to Europa and pierce through this ice layer, we might be able to find also thermal vents on Europa and life thriving at these locations. So there's really going to be a lot of opportunities for us to look at planetoids, comets, asteroids, various things that are in abundance in our solar system. And as we deploy more space packages, drones, and craft actually piloted by people, we're going to study more of these debris and comets, start to mine asteroids, and not only are we going to find exotic elements, but more than likely we're going to change our understandings of what it means to find the signs of life. Now, obviously we get to a more interesting topic, which is human evolution, bypassing a large scope of data and looking at evolution in general. There are so many questions that still need to be raised about just how did we get here? And really, that's the more important question. So really, that boils down to the idea of a missing link. And I obviously would take my hat off to gentleman Lloyd Pye that you see here, who wrote a book called Everything You Know Is Wrong. Now, Lloyd did a very esoteric level of research that looked at all the various Australopithecine and Neanderthal and various bone structures that we have that look at this Darwinian evolution process to say that something ever so simplistic will become ever more complex. Well, that might not always be the case. There's definitely what we've called a missing link in the human evolution scope, because if we look at the Neanderthal man, to us, all of those bones and types of beings that have existed, there's definitely nothing that connects us to any of them. There's a huge gap from Neanderthal or Australopithecine, any of these pre-hominid man, to what we have today. As far as looking at our DNA, our double helix DNA, there's a lot of differences. Now, obviously, in comparison, we're very close to the chimpanzee, and that would raise a lot of questions as to why there's literally only a 1% difference in DNA from a chimpanzee, yet somehow we're completely evolved into a different path outside of any other animal on the planet. That's another question that we'll have to come back to. But there's definitely a missing link. Everyone acknowledges that the Darwinian evolution, that view, can explain the gaps of why these large ape-like beings covered in hair, perfectly adapted to the jungle, and then all of a sudden us. If you stripped us naked and threw us in a jungle, we'd get scraped up by branches, get sunburned. We're not adapted to being in the jungle or even being freely in nature. So it is very interesting to look at the human process, that somehow there is this missing link, and it is acknowledged by the scientific community. Now, when we start to go down this path and realize, well, all right, where is the oldest civilization that we have? Where does the first signs of high civilization and culture show up? Right now, folks, we put that at 3800 BC on the shoulders of the Sumerian culture. Now, the books are definitely changing as I record this video, because we are finding sites all around the world that are pushing back the needle of time, probably well beyond 50,000 BC, let alone 3800 BC. So we have a lot of catching up to do, folks, but let's starting off from the academic viewpoint, the Sumerian culture, that rests on their shoulders for the first high civilization, a complete civilization to show up, 3800 BC. And really, the Sumerian culture is fascinating from two perspectives. One, they have a wealth of information. They literally created over 100 of the firsts needed for a high civilization that we still use today. But two, they have all of the modern biblical tales of Noah, the Great Flood, Adam and Eve, all of the great tales that we have in the King James English version of the Bible can be traced back through the Hebrew versions, through the Akkadian versions, to what you're going to see today in the Sumerian cuneiform scripts, the biblical tales for the origins of our modern day King James version of the Bible. So pretty interesting information, because these artifacts still exist and are a much more condensed story rather than the consolidated stories we have today. Okay, so what we're talking about is this fertile strip of land here, which was once called Sumer, right between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers here, this fertile strip of land. And what we found in this area are thousands of tablets and cylinder seals, which you see here, and many types of artifacts, from figurines and jewelry to actual physical locations like the city of Ur, which we thought was a mythical place, but no, it's real. So the Sumerians had a very ingenious way of having this system of writing. And we think we're complicated with our 26-letter alphabet. The Sumerian cuneiform script consisted of over 400 characters. So they had this system of writing where they would use an oversized screwdriver and turn it and twist it in the wet clay to make the symbols that you see here. But they also had cylinder seals, where they would reverse carve images, scenes, onto a curved surface. Scholars today still don't know how they did this. They would reverse carve an imprint so that when you would roll it over wet clay, it would leave the positive imprint. So they were able to disseminate pictograms with actual texts, kind of like an ancient newspaper, if you will, quickly throughout the town. And they had an unbelievably complex math system. They used two numbers, 6 and 10, to form a sexagesimal system. And they could essentially divide into very small sizes, very large sizes, very interesting geometric shapes. This comes out of a book by a scholar named Zecharia Sitchin, who, in uncovering some of the Sumerian tablets about math, talked about when they would have someone that was married and would get a divorce, or someone would die and they would need to split up the property of the family, it would say, well, since you're a brother, you get here, or since you're an aunt, you get this slice. If you're a niece or an uncle, so they divided it up based on the weight of your family presence and used math to calculate the plot of the land. But really, what's really interesting here about the Sumerians is the fact that their number system and calendar is what we still use today. 12 months in a year, 12 in a dozen, 12 inches in a foot. All of this information are derivatives of their base math of 60. They were the first ones to even give 360 degrees to a circle. So it's a very interesting math system where literally sprung up right out of the Stone Age at 3800 BC. Just there is no preceding culture from the Sumerians that we know of yet. Okay, so really, again, one of these scholars that I highly recommend to dive into our origins is Zecharia Sitchin. Now, Zecharia Sitchin has been publicly chastised for his research, and he passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago at the age of 93. But Zecharia Sitchin did 50 years of research. That's 50. And there's really no one today that has done that level of research for that long. And unfortunately, people who attack Sitchin really do not have any challenging basis in their linguistic skills. There's really two forms of information when we look at our ancient past. There are the written texts, and then there are the artifacts. So Sitchin was definitely an expert in the written word. And anyone who challenges Sitchin on the written word should really have a basis to challenge him in. And there's a lot of scholars out there today writing books or throwing up websites trying to challenge Sitchin, and they really have no basis in their education because they're challenging Sitchin from the wrong viewpoint. He is a linguistic master, and you would need to have the right credentials and background and that time in the field to get anywhere near the type of research he's presented. So Zecharia Sitchin wrote a book called The 12th Planet, and then spawned out over, I believe it's 10 or 11 books in something called the Earth Chronicles series, where you can really see how all of this information from these ancient times, when it appears man was interacting with living gods and living more peacefully with the earth, all of this information was recorded from cultures around the world and seemed to be sharing in a global epoch of a much more interesting time than what we have today, being disconnected from our spirituality or from these ancient gods that all the cultures seem to speak of. But again, focusing on the Sumerian culture, Zecharia Sitchin was one of the first to bring out some of these creation tales that are written in this ancient Sumerian text called cuneiform script and show the parallels of this information to our modern day Bible as possibly the original stone tablets telling this story. Pretty heavy. Now, what we have in the form of these tablets are usually on semi-precious stones, but as I mentioned, they would also turn it and twist it on wet clay, and then put that clay tablet into a stove, literally keying that phrase, writing in stone. So they had several artifacts that would display sometimes pictographic information, but also sacred information. And there were astronomer priests that would only hand down this information to other priests as sacred information. These stone tablets, for instance, talk about the zodiacal breakdown of our heavens, the 12 symbols that make up a celestial clock of time. We call it the 12 houses of the zodiac. The Sumerian culture was one of the first cultures that actually utilized this astronomy-based calendar system. Just like we now know many cultures, over 30 in fact, used a very accurate astronomy-based calendar system of time. Mayans, Hindu, ancient Egypt, Sumer, all around the world utilized this ancient time by watching the movements of the heavens and using the 12 constellations of the zodiac as a grand celestial clock. Obviously, we'll come back to this topic. Now, several of the tablets seem to describe and give the same references to where these beings came from that were interacting with the Sumerians. The Sumerians gave a word for these beings that was Anunnaki, and the term Anunnaki simply meant those who from heaven come to earth. They were always symbolized with a winged disc, or symbolized with having wings. And this predates Christianity by at least 4,000 years. Hebrew versions of the of angels and the watchers and the fallen ones and the Nephilim, again, thousands of years even before these stories. So we'll circle back to the topic of the Anunnaki, but what's obviously key to the Sumerian information is that they recorded the movements of the heavens, sometimes over hundreds of years in certain scales. And this was all sacred information. They could literally tell you 50 years in advance on one specific day when there would be a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse. So they monitored the movements of the heavens in a very religious way and recorded this information as sacred data. We have several tablets that come out of the Sumerian culture that speak of our outer planets in our solar system, the distance between our outer planets, what the outer planets even look like in space, calling Uranus and Pluto Mosh Sea, bluish green. Now, we weren't able to confirm any of this information until the late 70s and 80s when we sent Galileo and Voyager, our space probes, to the outer planets and finally took color pictures. And wouldn't you know it, it confirms the Sumerian descriptions from thousands of years ago. So obviously they had very accurate astronomical data. How? Now, again, this was sacred information. So a lot of this information was recorded from an actual priest sitting in front of an Anunnaki. There would be a scribe, someone who could read and write cuneiform script, that would sit there with the priest and would record all of this information in front of one of these gods, one of these Anunnaki. And we literally have thousands of these tablets still in their original form today in museums around the world. Now, some of these tablets get into some very interesting topics. This one, for instance, even though it was badly damaged, we're going to focus on just this section here. What this section talks about really should raise a lot of questions. It talks about the path that these Anunnaki took from their mountainous planet to get to Earth. And they literally talk about they had to pass by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 planets before they arrived at Earth. And you can see words on the side here: high, 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 vapor, clouds, rocket, rocket, pile up, mountain, mountain. How is this information on a stone tablet that's at least 3,000 years old? So this really raises a lot of questions. And if you think of the idea that they said they had to pass by 7 planets before they got here, again, we can start to look at some of this as astronomical data, and we'll circle back to that. It's a funny concept to think about that we're actually on the 7th planet, that sacred number 7. If you're coming from outside our solar system in, Earth is the 7th planet, not the 3rd rock from the sun, counting the other way. Okay, so really what I want to focus on here is this next part, which is the Anunnaki. And we understand that there are many cultures around the world, not just the Sumerians and their understandings of these Anunnaki. Even the Hindus talk about Krishna and various other gods that were a part of everyday lives of people living in our past. Let's call it the 3000 BC era. So what we have are, in more modern times, translated, consolidated versions of these stories where we have beings that are angelic with wings and have a glow. Well, where does this information really come from? And where exactly is heaven? All cultures just say that they came from the skies. Well, let's get more specific. The Sumerians were very specific in saying that these beings, the Anunnaki, literally had the power of flight, and they depicted them always in this type of a winged craft. Now, there were no hot air balloons, there were no glider planes. The only thing flying at the time in 3000 BC were birds. So the only way they could convey flight was to use a natural, no technological reference, a natural reference. They would give it wings. But you can see here, even the wings don't quite look like wings. They're more a symbolic reference. Now, we can see that this Anunnaki is coming down to meet a Sumerian king. And always we see this over and over, that this platform is being held up by the civilians so that this interaction can take place. I jokingly like to call these the taxpayers. But over and over, we do see this scene throughout Iraq, throughout Iran, where the Anunnaki are depicted coming down from a winged disc, usually in some type of conveyance of flight that shows them with wings, coming down to meet a Sumerian king. Over and over, we see this depiction as a religious stela. They didn't carve these intricate things as just mythology. This is sacred information that they're trying to bequeath to us, where a picture is 1,000 words. We just need to understand the dialect. So it's a very interesting tale that to realize over and over, they talk about these interactions with these beings that came down from the heavens. This couldn't have been just mythology. What's really interesting too is the detail in which they went to describe these beings. This is a statue after one of the Anunnaki, a female Anunnaki called Ishtar or Inanna. And what's really interesting is not only look at the level of detail, literally screws in the hand. It's an amazing artifact. But there's a text that came along with Ishtar, which is very interesting. She liked to roam the skies of Earth and look for male cohorts to take up into her sky abode. Unfortunately, when she would do this, the males would usually not return. So one time she propositioned a Sumerian king named Gilgamesh, a very famous figure in our history. And since Gilgamesh knew of her not returning the males, he said, no thank you. Even though you're extremely beautiful, I'll pass. So very interesting, some of the tales that we come out of our history. Now, a lot of the symbology, again, is depicting information about these beings that I think is very interesting. We can see symbolic references here of holding a pine cone. It's basically, again, the representation of the fruit of life, knowledge, the pineal gland. We see here a basket of water, the water of life. All of this, again, is symbolic references. But then, interestingly enough, here we see something that could be a wristwatch. That, again, should raise some questions. Now, you think this is just an analogy that they're trying to show us, but pay close attention. What happened when we land the first man on the moon?
Big shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right level. 30 seconds forward, drift. We copy you down, Eagle. The Eagle has landed.
The eagle has landed. Now, what an appropriate choice of words. If we were to look at this symbol 6,000 years from now, do you think that they're going to say that we were landing birds on the moon? No. More than likely, they're going to understand that we're saying we had the power of flight. And that's exactly what we see when we look at these Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki and realize that what they're showing us is a being that literally had the power of flight. And over, we see these references coming out of ancient cultures. Okay, so kind of moving on here, some of the references also show a very interesting similarity to our DNA strand. This tree of life is something that over and over we've seen in modern references towards our double helix. Now, you can go to any doctor's office and see this 2 entwined serpents. That again is a symbolic references for modifications to our DNA or understandings that we are a double helix DNA. And this goes back even to our most ancient of times, that somehow they depicted this information. And always depicting above it or involved are these beings that had the power of flight, the Anunnaki. So it's a very interesting tale that, around the world we have these various depictions of what appear to be scenes over and over of man interacting with these beings, the Anunnaki. And these are tablets that are found in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in Turkey, around the world. There are cylinder seals where mainstream science has these on display and is translating what we see here from a very basic and high level. But modern academics is not willing to, they pretty much have drawn a line in the dirt. And anything that talks about these beings, the Anunnaki, coming down and having interactions with man, this is all mythology. It's made up, is what they say. I don't think so, folks. I think what we're looking at here is a very deep level of very high esoteric sacred information that we need to decode. Now, we don't look at the ancient languages and pictograms the same way that we do today. Think of a lot of these symbols as acronyms, like FYI means for your information, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. But when you see CIA, you instantly know it's an acronym. And that's exactly how these ancient cultures used symbolic references. Sumer, Egypt, Mayan, they all used these symbolic acronyms. A picture is 1,000 words. So keep that in mind when you see these ancient scripts. Sometimes this scene is actually meant to display a much more intricate wealth of information than just one simple meaning. Now, again, look at the detail and intricacy and design that they went into these artifacts, the colors and things, and always this prominent winged disc. This really does raise a lot of questions. We have to wonder why around the world at the 3000 BC era, whether it's the Hindu god Krishna living at the city of Dwarka, as we've talked about, or the Sumerians interacting with their living gods, the Anunnaki. Something took place well in our past that we are now disconnected from, and we must find out why. Now, again, some of these tales that we have in the English version of the Bible talk about, for instance, the 7 days of creation. Well, in Sumerian, there are actual 7 physical tablets of creation that give you a much more elongated tale of about how we come into existence. And this is really crucial information, folks, because just like the Bible says today, there were once giants upon the earth. We as ancient explorers need to look into our past at many of the ancient cultures, many of the ancient sites, and truly discover where we really do come from.